Hello, and welcome to Week 12's article and lesson facilitation. Today, I'm going to present a summary on Chapter 1 of the book, On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life by Sarah Ahmed. On Being Included is a narrative about how diversity occurs within colleges and universities. Sprinkled throughout the book and this week's assigned reading, it includes one-on-one interviews with diversity practitioners. The intended audience is primarily academics and professionals in the field of higher education. In describing the aims of Chapter 1, Ahmed points out how it will encompass ideas about why institutions are important for diversity practitioners. She gives us insights on what institutions can teach us about their significance and how the lens of intersectionality can help us understand diversity work within institutions. In the section of the paper on institutional diversity, Ahmed notes that one of the primary goals of diversity work is to institutionalize diversity. If this is the main goal of diversity workers, it might run in conflict with the institution's objectives because diversity isn't always one of their primary goals. Ahmed points out that the tendency for institutions is to automatically make snap decisions, which could be termed as second nature or background decisions. She argues that topics concerning equality and diversity should become one of these automatic issues. Diversity workers need to be persistent in advocating inclusive ideas because this ordinarily isn't how institutions normally think. She continues by stating that many diversity practitioners run into resistance when trying to implement policies. One expression that was consistently mentioned again and again in her interviews described the process on page 26 as, quote, banging your head against a brick wall, end quote. As a word of caution, Ahmed suggests that practitioners shouldn't try to persist by making diversity an unequivocal institutional end in attempts to bring diversity to the forefront because that ceases to make it habitual or an automatic thought. In the second part of the section on institutional diversity, Ahmed offers solutions to some of the problems that diversity practitioners face. First, diversity practitioners need to put diversity at every step of an institutional organization. As Ahmed puts it on page 29, quote, practitioners do not simply aim for diversity to become part of an organizational body or machine. They want diversity to go through the whole system, end quote. Second, diversity work is about getting multicultural ideas into the bloodstream of an organization so it can reach diverse people. This can be done by developing diverse communication strategies. Third, practitioners need to figure out who will speak up for diversity as a method of getting it into institutional conversations. In addition, diversity workers must be mobile and willing to speak to all university employees at any meeting at any time. Lastly, diversity workers must progressively realign their offices with the key parts of an institution by becoming embedded in the structure of the organization itself. Workers figure out ways of working with the institution so they can reaffirm the existence of the diversity office. In the next two sections, Ahmed cautions her readers with some of the challenges that diversity workers might encounter during their work. The first of these trials is institutional whiteness. Ahmed begins his conversation by noting on page 33 that, quote, the very idea that diversity is about those who look different shows us how it can keep whiteness in place, end quote. If diversity is something that becomes appended to institutions, like positions of color, then it confirms the whiteness that is already in place. To combat this, we must understand that diversity work involves rebranding the face of the institution. An investment of such images helps teach us about the importance of multiculturalism and how diversity workers can manage this internally and externally within an organization. Ahmed follows this point by giving us several examples of how whiteness can be perceived as a habit within institutions that often goes unnoticed. The second challenge that diversity workers might come across during their work is institutional racism. Ahmed begins this section by pointing out on page 44, quote, the struggle to recognize institutional racism can be understood as part of a wider struggle to recognize that all forms of power, inequality, and domination are systematic rather than individual. Not only does racism include the acts of individuals who wish to discriminate against others, but it can also extend to the unfair actions that an institution engages in. Ahmed adds that if we were to eliminate the one racist individual in a racist organization, we would just be preserving racism at the institutional level. The act of terminating the individual only creates the illusion that we're extinguishing it. Ahmed also describes another form of institutional racism, which can be transfigured into the form of an institutional therapy culture, where the institution is described like a sick person who receives aid with the right kind of treatment. We must also guard against this kind of culture because such treatment therapy implies a form of admission of guilt that could recede temporarily, but it could eventually creep its way back into the organization. If we think about Ahmed's ideas about institutions in Chapter 1, we must reflect and realize that Ahmed isn't just addressing higher education professionals, but to every one of us as current and future librarians. I would argue that institutional diversity office units don't exist in libraries because the entire library is a diversity office, with its staff as diversity practitioners. It is therefore our responsibility to implement diversity policies and diversity work by applying some of the ideas found within the ACRL diversity standards and the IFLA multicultural communities guidelines for library services. Each of these documents can help guide us in our work as both current and future librarians and diversity practitioners. Here are my questions for the week. Question 1. What are one or two key ideas from this reading that you might try to incorporate within the library you work at or your future library work? And question 2. Do you agree with Ahmed's perspective about institutional life and her view about institutions in this reading? Why or why not? Here are all my references. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.